Hi, and welcome to module number 2 of Sleep Matters. This session is called Sleep Dysregulation Across the Lifespan. Hold on to your hats because this is intense. I need to remind you right here that this session builds on the information from the previous session. And in this conversation in today's module, there will not be any solutions presented. This is all inquiry into various challenges that impact sleep across the lifespan. And module 3 and 4 is going to look at treatment, tools, and ways of supporting our sleep challenges. So stay focused on the learning, which keeps building on the next pieces. That's my invitation to you. Sleep dysregulation. I'm opening with this slide because it kind of sets the stage for the legacy of unfolding of what happens when there is chronic sleep challenges across the lifespan. There is a higher risk, the operative word here is risk, of approximately 12% that predisposes one to a higher risk of mortality if there is sleep deprivation of less than 7 hours a night or more than 7 hours a night across a long period of time. That if sleep is not within this window of balance across our lifespan, it impacts the way that our protective factors are sustained for our health and well-being. And I was reading how this related to our telomeres. Our telomeres are the protective shoelace tips that sit on the end of our DNA. And these little protective factors, they stop our DNA from fraying down across our lifespan. And one of the elements that telomeres are vulnerable to is stress. And sleep deprivation or sleep dysregulation is a stressor. And so your telomeres, which protect you from disease, protect you from autoimmune situations, they become more exposed and vulnerable with these loads of stressors across our lifespan. So inadequate sleep is linked to chronic conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes. Hypertension is interesting because it is so much a regulatory function of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So we learned in module number 1 that the parasympathetic-sympathetic balance is strongly supported by regulated sleep. So hypertension would be definitely an outcome of this imbalance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Depression, obesity, these are also factors that you'll hear more about in this module. Women, interestingly, have in research been shown to have an increased risk of coronary heart disease when their sleep is shortened across time. And this also relates to the sympathetic parasympathetic balance and heart rate variability that is a part of the sleep cycles that we talked about in our last module. So it seems that women need a greater degree of balanced sleep specifically for the health of their heart. Let's talk about brain development and neuroplasticity as it relates to sleep. So when you think about the developing brain, that's when you're in childhood, and neuroplasticity, which is forever until you stop breathing, slow wave sleep, which is non-REM sleep, and those sleep spindles, that's that very specific wave that happens in non-REM. These are needed for synaptic remodeling. It's kind of like a city planner who comes along and maps out how the roads are going to meet and how traffic is going to become most efficient. Well, these sleep spindles, which happen in deep sleep, they are helpful to the city planner in not falling asleep at the job and having roads go to the wrong direction, or, have to meet traffic flow or create traffic flow that is more chaotic. It's all about clarity, efficiency, and specific modeling of our neural pathways in the brain. So our sleep process in this phase, which happens a lot, you're going to find out in a minute, in infancy, is all about the hardwiring of the exclusivity of communication in our brain. So non-REM sleep is important for strengthening those connections and for neuronal firing that is efficient and capable of consistency. Deep sleep orchestrates synaptic plasticity and pruning, cutting back the stuff you don't need. Like, I don't need that extra noise in here. That's going to create too much chaos or lack of predictability in the signal. So it's during this long wave, slow wave, deep sleep that our brain becomes the most competent in its capacity for learning and memory. We see here neuroplasticity and sleep. What does this mean? Well, in order to be adaptable, in order to change, we need neuroplasticity. Boy, I've needed a lot of this in COVID-19. And there is structural plasticity and functional plasticity. And a lot of the structural plasticity happens when we are learning new things, especially when there are chapters of critical development in infancy, in childhood, in adolescence. And these are experience or memories that actually change the brain's physical structure. Functional plasticity is when there is damage to the brain and another part of the brain says, hey, I can do that job. And functions shift from one location to another and enable the brain to adapt and accommodate. Both of these things are reliant on regulated sleep for their optimum capacity. All right, let's talk about, right from the get-go, preemies. Very young preemies don't move as much or have as much REM as older preemies. And so when we see the 24-weekers versus a 35-weeker, there is a dramatic difference in their capacity for independent movement, as well as a decrease in their rapid eye. So there seems to be, what this means to me, a relationship between motor skill and REM. And so as we develop greater degrees of motor capacity, it seems that we then access more of that rapid eye phase, which, if you remember, there's a lot of paralysis that happens in the tone during rapid eye. So if I don't move, I'm not really going to need that, because that atonia is a function of, I don't want to act out what I'm dreaming about. And so we think about, I'm wondering myself in this moment as I'm talking about this, I don't think we have any literature on do fetuses dream. I don't know. It's pretty hard to do sleep studies, dream studies on a fetus. But I think when we look at movement against gravity, because a preemie is against gravity, as their motor system becomes more competent, you see a broadening of the cycles of their sleep. Young preemies also spend most of their time in light sleep. They're not hitting that non-REM, that really deep sleep, which makes it tricky for their brain to do that developmental construction that it needs to do. At term, at 40 weeks, preemies still don't have as much deep sleep as full-term babies. And you can start to think about, well, what does that mean? It means that their developmental processes are different. We just talked about how deep sleep is so necessary for plasticity and consolidation of brain pathways. So preemies have a bit of a disadvantage here in that the switches that help them move from one phase to another phase is limited. And although we don't yet understand why that happens, there is thought that the arousal system that we spoke so much about in the last module is poorly regulating. It's not capable, mature enough to initiate the symphony of sleep phases. And so this baby has to cope in an environment that it's not really ready to be in, and the brain maturity at a very primitive level, which is responsible for regulation, temperature, all the physiological regulation functions. This is what preemies have so much trouble with. Why they model, turn blue when you pick them up. Why they're so disorganized. It's their arousal system. If it's darker at night than during the day, during their growing period in the NICU, they may progress faster. And there's a lot of conversation in the prematurity literature talking about the environment in the NICU and ways to create greater opportunities for neurodevelopment without compromising survival functions. So remember, I can't sleep in the light because melatonin, is requiring changes in light in order for me to downshift into sleep. So if I'm in bright light all the time, and I already have a sensitive nervous system, it's going to be very difficult for me to find these different phases. So every single one of these slides, you're going to say to yourself, is it the chicken or the egg? Meaning, what comes first? The brain creates a sleep problem, or the sleep problem creates a neurological challenge. It's slide after slide, the essence of the conversation. A neurotypical, whatever that means, a non-differently abled newborn typically stays awake 2 to 3 hours at a time. And most sleep is between 30 to 45 minutes. And every 3 to 4 hours, there's this level of awake and sleep, awake and sleep. So the sleep doesn't last very long. And most babies don't make it to that 4-hour period of time. That 30 to 45 minutes, the lower end, is more common in newborns. Having a newborn sleep for 3 to 4 hours at a time is less common. And then there's this awake, alert, because I got to eat, because newborns, when they are sleeping, are growing. And so they need to wake up and generate the energy from their food to do the work that they need to do in their sleep. Isn't that fascinating? So they get full quickly when they eat. And you know how many newborns are eating and then they just nod off. And they have to, they eat and sleep and poop. And that's the cycle of a newborn, right? What every new parent knows. Babies in general, I love that little picture. By the time they're about 4 months of age, they spend twice as long sleeping at night than during the day, hopefully. But typically, you start to see by 4 months of age rhythms in sleep. Now, what's interesting to me about this age, when I think about it from a neurodevelopmental perspective, is a 4-month-old is developing midline and developing a sense of anti-gravity flexion. So 4-month-old babies, they can begin to reach in space. They kind of push up on their arms. And all of that ability, once we find that midline, there is a greater degree of serotonin in the nervous system. And that serotonin foundation, as you learned in the last session, helps us to keep our sleep in a much more regulated bandwidth. So you see babies who have this is a theory that I have, who have this ability to develop their sense of middle in spending time on their tummy and time on their back when they're awake, that this contributes to the neurochemistry that then may feed into their sleep cycles. And by 6 months, you're sleeping through the night typically. Now, a 6-month-old is able to begin to sit. And so you've got an even greater capacity to shift your weight on and off of your center. And you've got a greater degree of inner core stability. And your inner core being your diaphragm, your pelvic floor, your transverse abdominis. 6 months is kind of the magic when that inner core starts to really become more efficient against gravity. And what's so important to understand about the inner core is its relationship to the vagal system, which is all parasympathetic and regulating in a down-regulation direction. So it's very exciting to me to think about, again, this is how Kim's brain works. Holistically, all these different factors play into each other. So if I'm a neurotypical baby and I'm moving in these patterns, which are wired into me, they have a neurochemical sensory experience, which then contributes to my regulation of my physiology. And sleep is an outcome of that. One thing that starts to happen at 6-7 months is babies begin to experience separation anxiety. And this may affect sleeping on your own, so that there's a greater degree of connection to my people, and I am conscious connection to my people. And when they leave, I don't yet have object permanence to know that they're still there. And so this heightens the primitive brain's fear response, and you start to see a need for greater soothing and reassurance, and that allows the baby to settle as they transition to sleep. I can just feel the questions in people's minds. So when we have our question and answer time together, it would be great to have those questions ready for that conversation. 50% of a baby's sleep is in REM. And this is fascinating to me. So you see that REM is very important in the beginning. So we talked about preemies, the younger you are as a preemie, your sleep is lighter. And that REM phase, which we still don't always know what it's for, has a lot of vivid connectivity. It's believed to help us develop our consciousness. So from a theoretical perspective, maybe babies are really developing the sense of connection to the world in this phase of their sleep. The other 50%, which is different than adult, you'll see shortly, is in deep, restorative, slow wave. And the muscle paralysis observed during REM atonia isn't fully developed in babies because babies don't need it yet. Babies still twitch and move during their REM phases because they don't have enough independent movement skills to fight or flight or run or hit during their sleep, so that muscle paralysis function doesn't come online for a baby until at least they are 1 year of age. And what's cool about that is, of course, at 1 year of age, you can typically walk. So you need to have, there's an adaptive response to the shutdown of the movement system in relationship to the increasing capacity for independent movement. And I want you to remember that because, there's a whole interest arising in sleep work, looking at syndromes, challenges like multiple sclerosis, places where muscles lose their tone, lose their activation, and an accompanying change in the neurochemistry and phases of sleep. And a wondering, what short-circuited what? There is not a single human function right now that isn't being studied related to sleep. It is a hot topic. That's my experience. This could become someone's life's work. This 1-2 hour lecture could be a 4-day workshop all by itself. And each one of these phases could be its own workshop. So I'm trying to just give you a little hit of what you might think about at different age ranges. Now, sleep dysregulation in babies is when we pay attention. And sometimes pediatricians pick this up, and sometimes they don't. But this particular paper was a really big, whoop, for my eyeballs. And it was published this year. Sleep onset problems and subcortical development in infant later diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So the message from this study is not always, but sometimes dysregulation related to the phases of sleep in infancy can be a predictor of future unfolding mental health or neurodevelopmental disability. That this is something that you and I need to know. That when babies experience, look at those hands, right? This is part of the extension, the stress response in the hands. So when we see high states of arousal, dysregulated sleep, there is a strong connection between that observation and the list of things we need to pay attention to identify kids that are at risk. So, and we know it because it's a common reason why babies might be referred to us. My kid doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, has huge emotional outbursts that are outside of my capacity to soothe. I have to keep, put my baby on the washing machine or the dryer in order for them to fall asleep. We have to drive around in the car all night. These are reports that parents share about their child's inability to shift states. In my understanding around trauma, infants that grow up in adversity, infants that grow up in homes where there is chaos, addiction, chronic unrelenting stress, where there is a parent who has mental health challenges, that these co-regulating caregivers are not able to shift and attune to a baby's communication, which is the job of a co-regulator, is to help babies make these transitions into sleep, into wake, into engagement. Right? So when a caregiver is preoccupied with their own suffering, sleep is one of the functions that is altered. And you see this ironically and sadly remain as one of the long-term outcomes of early infant trauma. That when we look at adults who experienced adversity as children, they may not have necessarily psychological re-experiencing of trauma, but over 80% of them continue to experience difficulties with sleep. Because, and Dr. Bruce Perry talks about this all the time, the younger you are, when you experience a developmental interruption, the more primitive your functions that were developing at that time, they become the ones that are the most disadvantaged for you. So your cognition might be just fine, but your problems with eating and sleeping and emotional regulation and sensory integration will be your problem. because of the chapter in which that developmental trauma happened. Now, another experience that happens for kids who are experiencing a lot of chaos in their lives is that they have difficulty with night terrors because they can't make sense out of what's happening to them in their day. And so it comes out in their sleep. So you're seeing a lot of this heightened activity in especially the REM phase, and even sometimes sleep apnea in infants with situations which means I'm having paucity in my breathing because of my high level of fear that I'm trying to work through that I don't have the skills to do. And many babies have trouble, I said here, yielding to the unconscious, which means letting go. If you're in a vigilant state all the time to your environment, that shift to a down-regulated state of calm is very difficult. And many children, especially, in the work that I have done with kids with sexual abuse, is a lot of times abuse happens at night, at around bedtime, around sleep time. And this becomes a contingency. Sleep, trauma. Sleep, trauma. And that, again, has its fingers in a person's legacy of their lifespan. That's a hard one to hear, but it's an important one because for me as a clinician working in mental health, every one of my clients has trouble sleeping. And it's this place where I can genuinely let go. And that may never feel safe to be in that state. We talked about the default mode network in the brain, that place that rests, that when your mind is wandering, when you're just, in the shower and you're just thinking about whatever you're thinking about, and there's no focus, you're not preparing a PowerPoint. And what we see absolutely hijacked is the default mode network from chronic unrelenting stress. And so when that happens, this is such a powerful image. A mom here with chronic depression and a baby, they look like two islands, right? So the baby's brain doesn't ever get that network developed because that network comes from, here, let me just help you feel better. And then the brain goes, and that network between the frontal, temporal, and parietal lobe goes, okay, I'm on. And if you remember, the default mode network is the home of highest self-reflection, identity, a sense of me. So if I never have that rest and reflect, then those cognitive skills are less available to me. The number one structure in the brain that I talk about all the time with respect to developmental trauma is the right orbital frontal cortex. And it's like mom's right orbital frontal cortex and baby's right orbital frontal cortex. They gleam and beam at each other. And there's this mirror of synchronized energy. So what's alive in mom's brain is alive in baby's brain. So if mom's full of oxytocin, and which is calming, and relaxed and available and connected, then there's this energy of the circuitry. And if we have what's happening in this image, you've got two right orbital frontal cortex systems that are not connected. And this doesn't, that structure is the only structure that says to the limbic brain, it's okay. You're safe and okay. So if that baby's right orbital frontal cortex is like, because there's no vibration here, then there's lack of inhibition of the lower brain functions of pause, wait, attend, it's okay, and you see executive function challenge. So this is partly important to remember how that developmental trauma impacts so much behavior and learning. Now, what's interesting here is the right orbital frontal cortex has a really high role, significant role, in depression and insomnia. It also has, the right orbital frontal cortex itself has a lot of reception to interoceptive cues. Am I safe? Am I okay? So the right orbital frontal cortex needs to be chill in order for me to lie in my bed and not hear every creak in the house. Because its job is to say, you're in a safe place right now. And the last 500 million times you were in your bed, everything was safe and okay. But if the right orbital frontal cortex didn't develop well, you never acquire that skill. And the brain stays on fire. And thereby, I call it a brain on fire. And thereby you feel depressed and you feel constantly anxious. This paper written in 2018 is so powerful here. It looked at insomnia and depression as a behavioral inquiry. And the number one structure that came up as ineffective in regulation of these two behaviors, insomnia and depression, was the orbital cortex, orbital frontal cortex. So the CEO of the brain, its job is to help us shift in and out of different ways of functioning in the world. So why I'm telling you this is relationship matters. Co-regulation matters. If you don't feel co-regulated, if you don't feel safe, you won't be able to sleep. Anxiety makes me think about all of our kids. I love this image. That struggle with sleep that you might think about, that have sensory processing disorder or autism spectrum disorder. But now I want you to sort of forget diagnoses again and just think about a brain on fire. The more sensitive the person's nervous system is to emotional information, the more likely their stress response will be chronically activated. And this kindles the amygdala, keeps it alive, keeps it oriented, keeps us vigilant. And anxiety is the most prominent variable that hijacks sleep. Now, here's what's interesting. As a child, this is one of the things I was reading that I'm thinking about, I don't have an answer, is that kids who have all this brain on fire, when they're little, they don't have a lot of thought. It's just a brain on fire. So the sleep is different, but there's no, well, I'm worried about this and I'm worried about that and I wonder about this and I'm wondering about that. As language develops, as a child acquires more language, 2, 3, 4, 5, they start to tell themselves stories to try and soothe their own anxiety. And what I mean by that is they look for meaning for why I'm anxious. And these become hardwired. Okay, I have an example. I used to have a recurring dream as a 4-year-old of fish. My dad had a fish aquarium apartment in the basement where he had all these beautiful tanks of rare and unusual and exotic tropical fish. And I used to spend hours with my dad, because this was his hobby, cleaning these fish tanks and looking at these fish. And they were part of they were our family, these fish. And we had this one tank with these really big, ugly ones. I don't even remember what kind they were. And they were like boring, but they were ugly. They didn't have color. So I remember saying to my dad, I don't like those fish. And he was like, why don't you like those fish? Those are the best fish in all these tanks. They're big. They're so rare. And I was like, nope, they're not beautiful. So I would dream about these fish, but they had teeth and they were ugly, and they would come up to the edge of the aquarium and they'd look at me. And this would go on night after night after night. And so it started to make me afraid to go downstairs into the basement where these fish were. For the next 17 years, I didn't want to go into the basement. It's fascinating. I began to have, and we didn't have fish anymore. I mean, we moved to a different house and we didn't even have fish. I was still afraid of the basement. So this is how, we try, as a child, we have all these heightened states, and then we try to tag them with meaning. And that's how often we acquire the fears that we have that don't make sense. So when you're anxious, the anxiety may come from within, and then it doesn't always come from a worry. As we get older, the worry, which is learned, it then activates the same circuit. So now, you're thinking there. Last night, for example, I was awake at 4 a.m. and I heard something outside the window that sounded like someone was there. And I sat up, looked around, got up, looked out the window. I was like, there's no one here. But as I laid in bed, I was then listening for that sound. And so the anxiety kept me vigilant. I had to go look, and then you're oriented. And my mind was, oh, forget it, go back to sleep. And it doesn't help. Because when the information is coming up from the bottom, the cognition is not very good at dampening that signal. So anxiety, I think people often misunderstand anxiety as being all cognitive, what you're ruminating about. But it really does begin with an illuminated activity in the lower brainstem's structures, which don't have any meaning. And thereby, it sets in motion this chain of reactions that subsequently can really disrupt your day-to-day function. And why I'm telling you that is we often think about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very important. But it doesn't really always get at functions like sleep, which are way underneath what's happening up here. That it really does mean that I have to shift safety, security, comfort in order for the brain to move into that new state of ease. So here's a wee bit, on sleep and children on the spectrum. Between 40 and 80% of children with autism spectrum disorders will have some form of sleep disturbance. Trouble falling asleep, frequent waking up, getting up early, having shortened durations of sleep. The greatest difficulty in the sleep studies that I read around kids on the spectrum is that they don't hit deep sleep. So all those functions of the dishwasher of the brain, and they already have lots of inflammation going on in their system. So they have difficulty with this deep, restful state. And so cortisol levels stay high, increases. So you see, you live in that high threshold on the edge of, it's not 0 to 60. I live at 59 because I really didn't clean it up in my sleeping state. And yes, you're right. It happens in other disorders as well. I know you're thinking that. What about ADHD? Infants with autism, who are later diagnosed with autism, are more likely than typical kids to have troubles falling asleep. And these infants also have more growth in their hippocampus. This is the brain's memory hub. There's a lot of studies looking at overgrowth in the brain with autism, where there's too much connectivity. There's not enough pruning and too much growth. And if you've got too much growth in the hippocampus, that's like woohoo! Absolute limbic, high-level activity that would absolutely make you live in that vigilant, overstimulated response. And, a lot of this is happening in that early infancy period when the symptoms of what we know as autism spectrum disorder haven't yet shown up. But it's behind the scenes unfolding. Brain-sleep relationships in this particular study were very specific to the hippocampus. And no significant relationships were found in the amygdala, in the caudate, in the globus pallidus, in the putamen, in the thalamus. The focus in this study was on the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is all about consolidating memory and laying down beautiful contingencies of learning. So you've got too much information in this particular situation that makes it impossible to have a predictability in your day-to-day experience. Brainwaves of children with autism are 25% shallower when they are sleeping. And so that there's less of this in their deep sleep. It's shallow deep sleep. How's that? And they have circadian rhythm desynchronization. Now, this is interesting because there are genes, we all have genes, DNA, that are responsible, we talked about this in the last session, that are responsible for the rhythm of our biological rhythms. And these genes are in the collection of genes that are often either mutated or altered in kids who show behaviors of autism spectrum disorder. So the actual genetics that directs the rhythmicity of sleep is different. And the processes of that hypothalamus are where these genes, collaborate to create that structure and its function, they're immature. And so the director, the conductor of the orchestra, the hypothalamus, is not as capable because its design is not typical in the way it was genetically organized. Remember, in autism spectrum disorder, there are so many variations of genetic dysmorphia that we all call one thing right now, the soup of ASD. And so there are many different kinds of autism. Now, sensory processing is a part of the sleep challenge for kids on the spectrum. Because when you have a very sensitive brain and you're very reactive to the environment, this is going to absolutely disrupt how you fall asleep, how you stay asleep. And studies show, Mazurek is he's one of my heroes here in looking at sleep in kids on the spectrum. And he was especially interested in sensory. So, for us as OTs, Mazurek and his crew looked a lot at sensory processing specifically as it relates to sleep in kids on the spectrum. They found that younger children with autism had more difficulties with their sensory interrupters than older children. Very young children with autism with high levels of sensory overresponsivity were really sensitive to the environment. So when we start to talk about, in our upcoming modules, modifications, the environment is a biggie. Background noise, light, room temperature, bedding, sleepwear, the amount of airflow in the room. These are all variables that interfere with the falling and the maintenance of sleep for our kids on the spectrum. I put in here GI, I put it here in this sequela of slides because gastrointestinal issues are so prominent for kids on the spectrum. Reflux, colitis, irritation, inflammation in the gut. And what's interesting about that is this impacts our kids on the spectrum, but it impacts everyone who has GI issues. Because inflammation of the gut disrupts serotonin production. And remember, the serotonin in your brain comes from the serotonin in your gut. And serotonin is a sleep switcher. It's very important in switching from phase to phase in your sleep. So when you've got inflammatory processes here, you're going to have altered sleep regulation. GERD, and also they're painful. Pain is a sleep interrupter. People with irritable bowel syndrome take much longer to fall asleep, have repeated nighttime waking, and excessive daytime sleepiness. So their chemical imbalances are part of this issue. And so we think about, in this particular study, the relationship between parent-reported GI problems, sleep problems, and autism in kids and adolescents. That this is one of the variables that is very high in correlation with kids who simultaneously have problems with sleep. So we have to put up that big bicycle wheel that I use all the time. We could put sleep in the middle. You're going to see this later. And all of these different variables are on the spokes of this bicycle wheel it's not just one factor that we have to think about, but multiple interrupters of the sleep regulation cycle. Okay, we're going to shift gears here into sleep and sensory processing disorder. Now, we know that there's one very powerful study, I can't pull it out of my brain in a second, but powerful study between a brain diffusion tensor imaging of kids on the spectrum and diffusion tensor imaging of kids with sensory processing disorders. And the difference is really that kids with autism have a lot of interruption in their temporal lobe circuitry. Whereas kids that we could truly tease out here as having sensory processing issues without the social engagement challenges don't have that temporal lobe circuit interruption in their development. So there is some literature that says these are two distinct pictures, but what they share is the parietal frontal lobe connection, where there's difficulty with dampening and making sense out of sensory information coming from the body and the environment. So what do we know about sleep in this group? Comes back to the reticular activating system, which is why I wanted to talk about it with so much depth in our last module. The ascending information from this arousal center shouts out to the cortex, look, it's a spider, and facilitates orienting, attention, and consciousness. So the reticular activating system is like, come on, this is novel, this is important. And the role of this network has another job. Its job, believe it or not, is to be the coordinator of the fight or flight response. Reflex. Like I said, spider crawls across your face. You don't want to go, is that a dangerous, poisonous spider or an irrelevant spider? You don't want consciousness to stop you from staying alive. So your fight, flight, get that thing off my face! You don't even think it. It just flies off your face because you've already screamed and jumped up and down. This is reflexive, and it is coordinated by the brainstem sending information directly to your motor system without thinking. So what I've just explained is why kids turn around and hit the kid behind them in line when they touch them accidentally. Or, there's light touch and it's an accident. You're just standing in line at the drinking fountain. Not right now, COVID-19. And the kid turns around and drills the other kid, and then they get suspended. Well, it was their reticular activating system keeping them safe. They don't even know why they were doing it. So tone, motor activation, these are problems for kids with sensory processing disorder. So when the reticular activating system is constantly like, it's a spider, when it's just, the fluffies in your socks, you've got constant reactivity, loop tapes that never make it up here for consideration. So we know that this is an important understanding of the behavior of our kids and why they do the things that they do. So the reticular activating system participates in fight or flight responses, and it's wired and chemically altered to be sensitive. The way that our kids are designed, they're like, that's their nature. Many of them are so orchid-like that any alerting or changing stimulus is registered as a new threat. So when this is overreactive, responses are overreactive, and you'll see startle, blink, and there's a beautiful study, and it's in this great book that I know that most of you would never read. It's called Arousal in Neuropsychiatric Disease. It's this thick. Well, it's on my Kindle, but it's, 3,000 pages or something. And it's a volume looking at the reticular activating system in every neuropsychiatric disorder we have in our known understanding of human behavior. And they talk about kids with sensory processing challenges as having excessive reflexive activity in their sleep, where you see more jerkiness in their hands, blinks, tonic movements in their sleep in relationship to environmental stimuli. It's like they're never really sleeping. Their brain is always watching for a stimulus. That's dangerous. Sounds awful, doesn't it? There's a high relationship between this load in the reticular activating system and nightmares. A hyper-aroused threat system increases rapid eye movement. Remember what happens in rapid eye movement. Vivid activity of dreaming. So this hyper-aroused state is characterized by nightmares and waking up frequently. And when you're awake, like I was last night, you're very vigilant. We see an increase in night terrors in kids with sensory processing disorders, where there's this fear of falling asleep and fear in sleep. Let's now shift into sleep and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In all of my reading, another recommended book that I found was The Science of Sleep by Time magazine. And there's a lot of research around sleep apnea, which we're going to deepen our awareness shortly. But mild sleep apnea, which is arousal driven, that regulates breathing while you're sleeping, is very common in kids with ADHD. And this disrupts solid rest. Sleep deprivation makes adults groggy, but in kids, it's wired. It makes them wired and cranky and agitated and aroused. So what you and I as adults might experience as, give me another cup of coffee, and then you have that wired, caffeine feeling. This is what kids on the ADHD spectrum experience within themselves. Wired and tired. Sleep restriction and sleep disruption result in daytime problems with attention and impulsivity. There is many studies way back to 1978 looking at a correlation between sleep and focus. Many teachers know this, that many of our kids come to school and sleep because they didn't sleep at night. And then their attention and their learning is less capable. Shorter sleep duration before the age of 3, in this study that I found in 2009, predicted hyperactivity, impulsivity, and limited cognitive performance. those senior executives of the brain, if I don't get that default mode network, then my salience network is on, my cognition is less capable. So just like my colleague that I admire, Dr. Gabor Mate, talks about, is this ADHD that's neurological and genetic, or is it ADHD symptoms that come from developmental trauma? Now I'm adding, it's a dysregulated state in the brainstem. It's like we have to think beyond diagnoses and come to the understanding that all of these disorders that experience dysregulation are having trouble at the level of the brainstem. That there's this circuit between the top and the bottom of the brain. See, I'm going in a circle. Top, bottom, bottom, top. Not top or bottom. Circle. Interferes with function, regulation, sensory processing, social engagement. And it doesn't matter what diagnosis you have. So for me, the brain drives clinical reasoning, not diagnosis. Teenagers, oh my gosh, they feel like they can sleep all day. What's interesting is as you head into puberty, your brain is now under construction again. There is a massive amount of growth hormone that turns on in this chapter. And by the way, there are several chapters in adolescence. It doesn't all happen in one shot. And so what results here, whenever there's more metabolic activity in growth, is a higher demand for sleep and rest. So teenagers need more sleep than their younger selves or adults. And their REM sleep duration decreases. They have more non-REM sleep in this chapter. That's why you go in and you check on them and they look like they're in a coma. Right? There's this, I'm out. And that's because there's more metabolic construction, consolidation, and cleanup happening in the adolescent brain. One of the challenges for teenagers is that they release melatonin later in the night, so that the drive for sleep changes. That's where you hear that night owl. And this is a conflict to get to school on time in the morning, or to go to, diving and swimming at 5 a.m. or any kind of scheduled activity for early morning. They've just fallen asleep. So it's very difficult for their nervous system to manage that. And in fact, what we see is teenagers in many cultures who go to school later in the morning and their day extends at the end of the day instead of that regime that they had when they were in elementary school, that their academic performance is improved because you're following the natural biological rhythms of their nervous system. In this image here, you see me have a teenager holding a screen. The problem with the screen is the light. And the light decreases or further decreases the release of that melatonin. And then, so many of our kids are up, teenagers are up texting their friends when they're lying in their bed or they're gaming. And so they further delay their sleep. So this becomes a chapter for many parents where sleep problems show up and they become problematic for the teen in supporting themselves with self-regulation. When we think about delinquent behavior, when we think about aggressive behavior, the label conduct disorder applies to kids, and oppositional defiant disorder comes into play more and more as the continuum of those behaviors expand towards adolescence and adulthood. And many of the behaviors that are associated with conduct disorders, such as delinquency, executive functions, impulse control, irritability, and emotional dysregulation, are also associated with sleep problems. In this study, this list of studies you see here, they have found that kids who come with this label, that if their sleep is improved in quality, that there is a greater adaptability in behavior when they are awake during the day, that their concentration, their well-being, and their ability to regulate themselves is vastly improved when their sleep problems change. So this is wow to me, because we get so focused on controlling negative behavior, and forever, from my perspective, this type of delinquency is a form of dysregulation. And this correlation between these behavior challenges and sleep reinforces my belief that that is the case. So we really want to take our eyes off the behavior and move our eyes into the regulatory system of the brain. Pretty wow. Research has found that kids or teens who lose a total of 60 minutes of sleep per night increase in their disruptive behavior, commonly found in conduct disorders. When we look at youth in custody for engaging in delinquent acts, there is reports of greater degrees of sleep challenges compared to high school aged youth in the general population. So kids in juvenile detention and in facilities that support youth at risk, there is a correlation between sleep problems, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. So wow, trauma, suicide, self-harm, high-risk behavior, and sleep are all in the same wheel. Very, very interesting when you think about how we engage and how we treat people from the perspective of our interventions. So much of what we do for people who experience behavior challenges is we punish them, or we, try to get them to change their behavior by extinguishing that behavior, or we introduce cognitive interventions, when really, again, this is all pointing to the facts that underneath cognition there are so many neural networks that are disrupted. Sleep and psychiatric disorders. Now we're going to head into mental health, into the realm of mental health. Depression. Oh my gosh. We could talk about depression for a month here. A person who has not slept well for several weeks or months will end up suffering from depression. And what's interesting is that there is a body of knowledge that says that when there's sleep deprivation, changes in mood, there is a change in inflammation in the gut. So remember we spoke earlier when we were talking about kids on the spectrum, how the gut inflammation created depression, changed behavior. Now we're going to see it the other way around. Difficulties with sleep, difficulties with mood, changes in the microbiome of the gut. So it's like a loop where all these pieces have to be addressed simultaneously to bring us back into a homeostatic state. People with chronic depression have different sleep cycles, and their release of growth and stress hormones is different. If you look at their waking cortisol levels in typical individuals with good sleep regulation, good sleep hygiene, their waking cortisol is the highest as it will be all day long. And then it goes down throughout the day and allows you to shift towards sleep. Whereas people with depression, their cortisol goes up and they have difficulties burning off that cortisol in their waking day, which makes it harder for them to go to sleep and clean up that cortisol. So it just keeps building on itself. In individuals with depression, the amount of rapid eye movement during the REM phase of sleep is out of balance. So what that means is it's erratic. It's not predictable. It's changes in duration and phase. It's not regulated. And so that whole, if you remember, I was going to say yesterday, in the last session, we talked about the purpose of REM is partly organizing your emotional life, your subconscious life. And if REM is out of sync, it will affect your emotional organization of your being. This is a really good new article, Sleep, Insomnia, and Depression, published last month, talking about how intertwined these two phenomena are. Post-traumatic stress disorder and sleep. Well, after a trauma, a traumatic event, a shock, an out-of-reality experience, if the person's capacity to reorganize that experience doesn't happen, then they fall into the category of post-traumatic stress disorder, where the elevated state of arousal is held perpetually, and the person re-experiences the trauma, lives in high levels of anxiety, and the brain is overstimulated. And there's constant bathing in adrenaline. Coupled with this vigilance, one of the number one symptoms of PTSD is sleeplessness. Flashbacks during sleep, waking from remembering and reliving and re-experiencing the troubling events or event. It comes up in REM sleep over and over and over again. This is such a signal of post-traumatic stress disorder. So what happens to many individuals with PTSD is, and this is part of what Theo has shared with me from our work in writing Conversations with a Rattlesnake, is the only way he could fall asleep was through addiction to substance that would shift his state for him. Because doing it on his own, he said the anxiety would mount every time bedtime would come around. And then the only way he could sleep was to pass out from drinking so much alcohol, for example. So this, you see the cycle between sleep, PTSD, regulation, and addiction. night terrors. In a study that looked at sexual abuse survivors, the most frequent symptom was chronic nightmares. Bad dreams can become habitual and repetitive, and it's like having a panic attack. It's a repeated neural pathway that just keeps getting reactivated in your sleep. Addiction. Different substances do different things to the neurotransmitters of our brain. But cannabis use, which here in Canada is legal, there is a very strong association between chronic cannabis use and sleep transitions. That there's a poor quality to the sleep phases when there is this constant embedding of cannabinoids in the brain. Because cannabinoids, they have a bias towards sedation, but there's this change in the receptor sites that happens in a chronic use of a substance that would then make the neurochemicals needed for all the transitions from phase to phase be out of balance. Most kinds of substances actively disrupt sleep, affecting the time it takes to fall asleep, how long you stay asleep, and the quality. Amphetamines, they are the most potent dopamine increasing drugs, and they are high. They make you high and alert. It's kind of like students who take Ritalin so they can stay awake to study, or drink a lot of caffeinated, or Red Bull, for example, where there's an upper quality to the state of alertness and arousal. This is very irritating to the reticular activating system, and it makes sleep very difficult. That's its point. And so chronic use of uppers disrupt the capacity to relax or shift down to start to transition towards sleep. Sleep paralysis. We're going to talk about a few things that you might or might not have thought about here. Sleep paralysis is a phenomenon where you're awake, sort of, but you're completely paralyzed in your body. There's a feeling of like being outside of my body, like I'm floating above myself. Pressure on my chest, like being in a coffin. The inability to move or speak. In this state, you're awake, but not quite. And there's a sense of, I can't catch my breath and I'm suffocating. And this is often linked to dissociation, which is a little bit like that floaty feeling of disconnection from oneself. And there isn't a lot of literature that deeply talks about this, but it is my speculation that sleep paralysis is a challenge in shifting between sympathetic and parasympathetic states in the autonomic nervous system, very similar to freeze, like you might see in a dissociative state. Sleep paralysis is this atonic lack of activation of muscles that usually happens when I'm falling asleep or just waking up. And in psychiatric literature, they talk about this as a hallucinogenic state. And it's connected to REM. And In some articles, they talk about it as REM parasomnia, where there's intruder hallucinations, like there's someone in the room, the feeling of a dangerous presence in the room, chest pressure hallucinations, vestibulomotor hallucinations, like I'm flying, I'm out of my body, or I'm falling. These are sensations that happen in this state that create trauma for people, where there's this panic that occurs during these experiences. Working the night shift, bad for you. Isn't that interesting? I think about me, who has had so much jet lag in one lifetime. Literature tells us that people who experience night shift, disorganization of their circadian rhythms, that this increases the potential for mortality by 11%. If they worked that schedule for more than 15 years, the risk of dying of heart disease was 38% higher than your peers. There's also a heightened risk of cancers when there is this day shift, night shift alteration. So, all our frontline service providers, our physicians, our nurses, our police officers, sleep is very, very difficult in getting their rhythms. And this longevity of this kind of rotation has been shown to have long-term health-related outcomes. Why did I put that beside sleep paralysis? It's because there is some speculation that chronic deprivation and interruptions of your sleep rhythm predisposes you to sleep paralysis. So there is a link between those two phenomenon, that people who are, that don't have good sleep hygiene because of their lifestyle, that puts them at risk for some of these challenges. Caffeine. Caffeine is the most widely used and abused psychoactive stimulant in the world. I'm one of them. What it does is interesting. We have a hormone called adenosine, which is part of the shutting down of the system in the body. It's not driven so much neurologically as it is physiologically. And there are receptor sites in the body and in the brain for this hormone. And caffeine docks itself in those receptor sites. So generally I need adenosine to go to sleep. And what caffeine will do is it'll go through your system, and the little satellite dish that's sitting there waiting for the adenosine says, oh, that fits in this lock and key. I'm going to take that. And the caffeine docks in there and blocks. It's a blocker of adenosine. So it inactivates that receptor and keeps you awake. Kind of tricks you temporarily into feeling alert and awake. And then there's a lot of adenosine just floating around in your body. And later on, you're going to feel worse. Because as the caffeine undocks, there's all this adenosine floating around in there. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted. or I feel wired and tired. And then you have another cup of coffee. And it just goes around and around in a circle. I get a dopamine hit just looking at those coffee cups. And it's not even just, for me, the feeling, as much as it is the taste and the culture and the aspect of drinking coffee. So the addiction combined with the chemical response is a very predominant interrupter of sleep. So that's why they say, don't drink coffee at nighttime. Now, interestingly enough, cacao, has a similar impact on these receptor sites. And just before I came on now to have this conversation with you, I took a bite of raw cocoa just because I needed a little bit of to upregulate and be more present and available. So we do these things in our lives to help us stay productive, or so we think. Matthew Walker, who is one of the world's sleep gurus, honestly, he wrote a book, Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. Matthew Walker has produced so many papers on sleep, and he has studied sleep in so many different disorders. And this is a very important book if you want to understand the different ramifications of different elements that hijack our sleep. Narcolepsy. This is when you fall asleep randomly. And it's irresistible. You cannot help yourself. It's where you have this urge to fall asleep at random times during the day, no matter how tired or awake you are. Like, it has absolutely nothing to do with your level of fatigue. Your level of regulation of arousal in your brainstem is completely out of rhythm, and you can't keep wakefulness. In the studies that I read, there is a chemical in the brain, it's produced in the hypothalamus, called hypocretin, or also known as orexin. And it plays a role, it's a hormone, plays a role in the melatonin circadian rhythm process. And there is, narcolepsy is seen to be an autoimmune disorder where the orexin is seen as a threatening chemical, and the immune system is Pac-Manning it, eating it up. And so it puts you in this state of not being able to know, should I be sleeping or awake right now? So this is a very, there's lots of research yet to be done on narcolepsy, but it can be a significantly disabling experience. There are people who fall asleep even when they would lose their driver's license because they couldn't predictably be capable of knowing when they just might lose consciousness. Concussion, brain injury. Concussion is perceived now as brain injury. And we used to, in my day, I sound like Grandma Kim when I talk like this, we used to say, don't let them sleep. Don't let that child who just banged their head go to sleep. This is damaging for the brain. This is not true. When someone has a concussion and has been evaluated, there's the caveat, has been evaluated by a medical professional, sleeping through the night is okay. Proper management is the key to recovery. and rest is a part of that. One of the things about concussion and brain injury is many people who have inflammatory processes in their brain as a result of a head injury, they actually need the rest in order for the inflammatory process to decrease. So sleep is actually an important part of the repair of concussion. Our own daughter has had 4 concussions, and for one of the 4, the episodes or the period of time of recovery was about 6 months. And her executive functions and her level of alertness was her greatest challenge. And I hear that a lot from people who experience concussions, is they have cortical fatigue. They can't concentrate. They try to do their work at the computer. Bob had meningitis last year, and he would sit at the computer and try and write an email. And he just couldn't keep his alertness. He'd just pass out at the computer. This is a very prominent outcome of inflammatory processes in the brain, is loss of arousal. And so rest is necessary for the repair. Could have a 2-day workshop on sleep apnea. And I'm just beginning to understand this because there is a perception that sleep apnea is linked to a lot of things. And this is a disorder where the airway gets blocked. And many sufferers of sleep apnea snore loudly or stop breathing for short periods. And some of it is really obvious. It sounds like a lawnmower outside when they're snoring, and you hear the and then there is a silent sleep apnea, where there is changes in respiratory function, but it's not obvious in the sounds that the person is making. So one of the things that happens for people who are sleep apneic is that they have drowsiness in the daytime and poor sleep quality, which contributes to raising their blood pressure. So you see sleep apnea and hypertension as a strong interactive force. And of course, in the future modules, we're going to talk about the use of a CPAP machine and what that can do to remember that hypertension is related to the sympathetic overdrive that's happening in dysregulated sleep. Thyroid conditions can affect sleep. They can cause obstructive. There's a difference between obstructive and non-obstructive. Obstructive is when there is actually an obstruction. And if the thyroid is altered in it because it's right here, then it can really change your breathing when you're sleeping. But it also decreases the tone in your esophagus. And you get more of that hypotonic palate. And that can contribute significantly to insomnia. Whereas when you're hyperthyroid, you have night sweats and a racing heart. So this is a big factor in sleep and why people with thyroid-related problems have so much trouble with sleeping. I bet you all of you are thinking about so many people right now. I can't tell you how many people are in my head as I'm talking about this. It's almost like it affects everybody in some way. There is a correlation between sleep apnea and nightmares. Persistent nightmares may be caused by the brain's reaction to, you get a sympathetic spike when you're not able to get significant amount of oxygen in your sleep. And some sleep apnea patients report having nightmares when they feel like they're suffocating or they're drowning, because they actually are having trouble breathing, and it translates into a real fear experience in their sleep. So that's why so many clients are suggested to have sleep studies, is to make sure that sleep apnea is not a part of the equation. I had a little guy that I was supporting who's only 7-8 months, and he had lots of reflux, and he was awake a lot. And even on the reflux medication that soothed the acid in his esophagus, he was still not sleeping. And one of the things I said is, that's vagal. If the esophagus is irritated, then the vagal tone to all of the muscles of the throat and the palate, they are also affected. And so this little guy went for a sleep apnea evaluation, and sure enough, he was having reflux and sleep apnea, and underneath it was a problem with the vagus nerve regulation. Here's another interesting factor: teeth grinding. It's got a fancy word. It's called Bruxism. And grinding your teeth or clenching your jaw, this happens for a lot of people when they're sleeping. And it can damage your teeth. It can cause jaw pain. Oh my gosh, I forgot the name of that joint. The joint in your jaw, you can have shearing forces between the mandible and all in through here, causing pain and headaches and tooth pain and difficulties with challenges in all the neck musculature. So, many people have night guards and look at ways of altering their alignment in their jaw. But there is a high correlation between sleep apnea and a body-wide stress response. And one of the things that happens when you grind your teeth is you release more serotonin. So it's almost like the jaw is moving and trying to down-regulate through that pathway, which is very interesting. But when the stress chemistry is high and your heart rate is up and your respiratory rate is up, one of the most common muscles to get activated in the stress response is the sternocleidomastoid. And that will, cause this tension into the jaw. So you can see this vicious cycle between stress, clench, grind, downregulate. So many people grind to try and diminish the stress flow, but the clench is a result of the increased stress chemistry that's happening when you're trying to breathe in your sleep. So we're going to visit this in our conversation around what do we do about this? But I don't know about you. I sure didn't know that grinding your teeth was related to the stress chemistry that can come about from sleep apnea. The last point on that slide there says, tooth grinding and jaw clenching can be an attempt by the body to reopen a collapsed airway. That it changes the position of the tongue inside the mouth, and the body's natural attempt to shift how, the body is organizing suck, swallow, breathe. Sleepwalking. These are situations where people are roaming around the house, not quite asleep, not quite awake, and they don't know. They often walk to the fridge, eat ice cream, go back to bed, and have no idea that they've just done that. They're difficult to wake in this state. Some of them do routine things. They get up, they go to the bathroom, they walk around, but they don't know that they're awake. Sometimes there's talking in this state. And this is a complex behavior that happens during non-REM sleep, really deep sleep. Because if you remember, in REM sleep, you have atonia, where the muscles are off. But in non-REM sleep, your muscles are still accessible. So when sleepwalking, the brain is partially awake and partially in non-REM. It's kind of like sleep paralysis. It's that in-between state, and there's no consciousness of the awareness of your actions. Many of our kids have movement challenges. Clients have movement challenges that interrupt sleep. And, one thing I want to slip in here is bedwetting. And there's lots of different reasons for why people will pee at night. One of them is partially related to sleep paralysis. You're so atonic, disconnected from your body, that your bladder tone lets go. So typically, loss of bladder function happens in non-REM phases of sleep, but some people will wet their bed because of the lack of activated motor control in their pelvic floor. And so there's already a pre-existing inactivation or lack of muscle tone there, that then when you have me relax even more, I have even less capacity. So we're shifting gears into that balance between the regulatory autonomic functions and now how the body affects how well we sleep. This picture kind of says it all, our kids with spasticity, our kids with hip dysplasia, our kids with very significant contractures. They're uncomfortable in their sleep. And so they require positioning and turning. And, when we start talking about the environment in our upcoming session, we're going to talk a little bit about ways to increase comfort physically in sleep. Pain and sleep have a very profound relationship with each other, and sleep disturbances increases pain sensitivity. So people with long-term sleep deprivation have a much lower threshold to pain tolerance. It's like their system is on fire, and their ability to manage that pain becomes less possible across time. So pain interrupts sleep. Lack of sleep makes more pain. It's again this loop. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? The neural mechanisms that pick up on pain signals, they evaluate them, and they activate our internal opiate system. But this is disrupted when you don't have sufficient sleep. You can't pull on your internal morphines and pain relievers because your chemistry is too much in fight or flight to do that. Sleep loss amplifies the pain sensing regions, makes it like, whoa, this is, and when you look at this image here, that's in the insula. And so the heightened pain sensing mechanism blocks analgesic output. And so brain imaging after a sleepless night shows increases in activity in the somatosensory cortex. Isn't that interesting? And deactivation of the nucleus accumbens and the insula. So you've got more sensory sensitivity, including pain. Nucleus accumbens is responsible for pleasure, less of that. That's where opiates are produced. And less insular, which is all about interoceptive connection to myself. And also a place where opiates are produced. So the pleasure centers, nucleus accumbens, insula, they're off. And the somatosensory cortex, which is like, where's that spider crawling across my face, is heightened. And so you see this malfunctioning. And this also, I think, when I think about this research, really makes me think about our kids with sensory sensitivity. Because many of the sensations that they experience in their over-responsive way actually is perceived as pain. So that their capacity to dampen those pain signals, it doesn't ever stop. So we see one other phenomenon. The brain does not know the difference between physical pain and emotional pain. So if I've got heightened physical pain, I also am more susceptible and vulnerable to stress emotionally. These, we talk about people who live in chronic pain and they often experience depression, and you think to yourself, well, yeah, I'd be depressed if I live in chronic pain as a reaction to the pain. It's not it alone. The physiology of the pain response actually causes an emotional disruption at a physical level, not even a reactive level emotionally. You just don't have the ability to elevate your mood, to engage in life, even if you wanted to. And this is why chronic pain is so misinterpreted, misunderstood. And sleep is like a pivot on the seesaw of, pain, mood, sleep is in the middle. That would help with both sides of that seesaw. I think you get it that we need to sleep, right? Inflammatory processes and sleep. Sleeping keeps inflammation in check because what it does is it creates this reorganization of our immune system while we rest. And we can't wash up or allow our inflammatory responses because they're like an army. Our immune system is a little bit like an army. There's a front line of defense, a middle line and a back line, and there's an order and a sequence to when different soldiers come to the war. And when sleep is dysregulated, this chain of command goes awry, which is very commonly seen in autoimmune disorders and certain types of cancers. So sleep, because it's a protection against stress, is a buffer to this inflammation. And inflammation is increased by stress. So anytime there's insomnia you've got greater inflammatory predispositions, which, calls into mind allergies, asthma, emphysemas, eczema, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, all see the list? Diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, joint pain, arthritis, Alzheimer's, autism. These are all inflammatory processes. And so there's this relationship. I've got to get your inflammation under control, and I've got to get your stress under control, and I've got to get your sleep under control for this harmony to be possible. Does your head hurt when you think about all this? Whew, here's a hot topic for me. No pun intended. Menopause and sleep. Postmenopausal women are very unsatisfied with their sleep. And as many as 61% of women report problems with sleep. I watched a YouTube video the other day around menopause, and they said the number one problem for women post-menopause is they don't sleep. And this is because when estrogen is, I don't want to say gone, but it feels like it. Estrogen has got a very sedative, harmonizing impact on the body. So the balance between estrogen and progesterone is so different, and it has a big impact on the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is like, what is going on? The melatonin doesn't work here anymore. Heat doesn't make sense. You see menopausal women who snore, who never snored before, and it often moves into sleep apnea because their reticular activating system is no longer regulated without the help of the hormone system, and thereby their arousal system is hijacked, and there's more likelihood for sleep apnea to arise in this era. While total sleep time might not change, quality does. So you might sleep 8 hours, but you sometimes wake up feeling like you just went to sleep. Hot flashes, when they happen, may interrupt sleep and frequently wake you up, and that can leave you feeling unrested. But this is because, especially during non-REM sleep, during REM sleep, there are detections of temperature change in the hypothalamus. So most of the time, hot flashes are happening in the REM phase of sleep. And that's got you in a sympathetic, upregulated state anyway, because you're dreaming and you're more alert and highly activated anyway. And then the slight internal changes in temperature, you're awake. And panicking because you just went from sympathetic arousal, hot flash, awake. This YouTube video said, you need some estrogen. We'll talk about that in our ensuing sessions, different kinds of medications and supports. Restless leg syndrome. This is considered a sleep and movement disorder. There's this urge to move the legs, to stop uncomfortable sensations like itching, burning, this feeling of crawliness or numbness, or like, I need to move. And this only happens when you're resting. And so it's only relieved by moving. So many people, and it has a lot to do with the dopamine system, People who, for example, take SSRIs sometimes experience restless leg syndrome because their dopamine serotonin balance is shifted by the change in the serotonin dominance, and they'll get this as a side effect. So dopamine related challenges. So when we talk about diet, when we talk about movement during the day, this can be an important part of changing this restless leg experience. But it's definitely can wake you up or inhibit your ability to fall asleep. Parkinson's disease. Restless leg syndrome and Parkinson's disease are both dopamine deficient issues, and they both respond to dopamine supports. So, if you have Parkinson's disease and you start to rest and your body starts to tremor, how do you fall asleep like that? Very, very challenging. The minute you go to rest, the body starts to move. And then you just can't truly shift into that sleep state. When I just think about that, it makes me feel the suffering of that challenge. The aging brain and sleep. Interestingly, we seem to need less sleep as we age. And chronic sleep challenges historically are a stressor on the body, and they change our telomeres. Sleeplessness changes our telomeres, as I said earlier, and it can accelerate some of the aging outcomes. Sleep deprivation absolutely ages our brains because we've had less of that cleanup. And when you talk about dementia and the collection of amyloid plaques and proteins in the brain, there is so much literature that links an inefficient immune cleaning up process, which you now know happens only when you sleep, to the collection of these unwanted pieces of garbage in the brain. So insomnia and dementia are very connected across the lifespan. And that's why so many trauma survivors, people with developmental trauma who haven't slept for their whole life, you see in the dementia population, in the studies that I'm reading, a significant correlation between developmental trauma, sexual abuse, neglect, the adverse childhood experiences, chronic sleep deprivation, and dementia. Dementia, there is a high sort of outcome of what we call sundowning, where as I'm supposed to shift down into sleep, I become more agitated. I start worrying and ruminating and engaging in OCD behavior or getting up and wandering. Bedtime is one of the worst times for individuals who are shifting into the realm of dementia. And we know that firsthand in our home, having taken care of my mom with significant dementia, putting her to bed, that's when she'd cry and worry and feel anxious and get up, and settling was so difficult for her. There is much less flow to clear away the debris in the aging brain. It's kind of like the garbage only gets picked up every 3 weeks instead of every week. And like any growing pile of trash, the molecular garbage affects the nearby tissues and cells and interferes with their ability to form and recall memory or plan even the simplest tasks. That's a beautiful quote from the Science of Sleep. So in that brief journey of understanding sleep across the lifespan, I am certain that you will be left with many curiosities, and I look forward to our conversation at our Q&A session to begin to unpack some of the questions that you might think about. So thank you for joining me for this module.